You have already begun to sense it. Not today, some time ago, a moment arrived quietly, the way a door closes not with a slam but with the faint, final click of a latch, and you stood on one side of it and felt the difference. You felt what it is to carry something without having chosen it. You recognize this. There is a weight. It does not sit in any one place. It is not grief, exactly, though it has the texture of grief. It is not obligation, though you have obeyed it your entire life. I have seen this weight in patient after patient across 40 years of practice, and I will tell you plainly, it did not begin with you. That is the cold fact at the center of what I wish to examine with you today. The psychological event has already completed. You are not approaching this weight, you have been inside it. The only question that remains is whether you will now see it clearly enough to know what is yours and what was given to you before you could refuse it. You inherited something, not property, not money, though those two carry shadows. You inherited a pattern, a set of responses, a constellation of fears, a posture toward the world that was shaped in rooms you were never in, by events you did not witness, by losses that were never spoken aloud in your family, but were communicated with perfect fidelity through tone, through silence, through the invisible grammar of how your parents moved through a room when something was wrong. The thread runs backward from you into generations you cannot name, and yet it runs through you. It expresses itself through you. It makes decisions through you. I have called this, in my work on the archetypes and the collective unconscious, participation mystique, a term I borrowed from the anthropologist Levi Brühl, though I found it necessary to extend it far beyond what he intended. In its original usage, it described the psychological condition of so-called primitive peoples, those who had not yet differentiated themselves from the world around them, who felt themselves connected, without boundary, to their ancestors, their tribe, to the animal world. But I came to understand through years of clinical observation that this condition is not primitive. It is foundational. It is, in fact, the condition we are all born into. We differentiate from it or we do not. And most people, I discovered, do not fully, not honestly. You were born already merged with your mother's anxiety, merged with your father's ambition, or his regret, which is often the more powerful of the two, merged with your grandmother's silence about what happened during the war, or before the immigration, or after the loss of the child that no one ever mentioned. You did not choose these mergings. They were the atmosphere of your earliest life. And the human infant is exquisitely sensitive to atmosphere. Before language, before memory as we understand it, you were already absorbing the emotional weather of those around you. You were already being shaped. What I want to examine with you is not merely the fact of this inheritance that much. I think you already know in some part of yourself, but the mechanism, the specific psychological machinery by which another person's unfinished business becomes your own driving compulsion. How your grandfather's unexpressed shame becomes your need to achieve. How your mother's unnamed grief becomes your inability to rest. How the forbidden anger of 3 generations becomes the depression that sits in your chest on Sunday afternoons and which you have learned to manage, but never understood. in my work with patients, and I saw, over the course of my practice, many hundreds. I noticed something that disturbed me initially and later seemed to me one of the most important facts of psychological life. A patient would come to me suffering from a compulsion, a fear, a recurring dream, a pattern of relationship that they could not escape. And when I examined the material carefully, when I listened not just to the content of what they said, but to the deeper music beneath it, I would begin to hear something that did not belong to them, a note that was too old, a grief that was too large for one lifetime, a rage that had a particular quality, not the hot rage of personal injury, but the cold, condensed rage of something that had been swallowed and swallowed again across years, passed down through the subtle education of daily life until it arrived in my consulting room, wearing the face of a person who insisted sincerely that they did not know why they were angry. I have called this ancestral layer of the psyche the deeper stratum of the collective unconscious. And I want to be precise about what I mean, because this is often misunderstood. I am not speaking of mysticism. I am not speaking of spirits or of past lives in any supernatural sense. I am speaking of something far more immediate and far more demonstrable. The simple fact that human beings are not sealed units, we are permeable, we are formed by our formation, and our formation does not begin at birth, it begins, in certain crucial respects, before birth, in the emotional world that we enter, a world already charged with the history of those who created it. The unfinished ledger, that is how I have come to think of what you carry. Somewhere in the psychic inheritance of your family, there is a ledger. Entries were made in it, losses that were never mourned, injustices that were never named, loves that were never expressed, angers that were never permitted. And because the psyche does not simply discard what is unfinished, because the unconscious is, among other things, a keeper of accounts, these entries were passed forward, not consciously, not deliberately, but with the same inevitability with which a river carries silt. The material travels, it settles in the next generation, and the next, until, in some generation, perhaps yours, the pressure becomes sufficient, that something begins to move. You feel it as a diffuse unease, as an obligation you cannot locate but also cannot deny, as a heaviness in the mornings that you have attributed to circumstance or to temperament, but which has a different quality when you examine it honestly, a quality of age, of weight accumulated over time, a feeling not of something pressing on you from outside, but of something carried inside that you did not pack. I want to tell you about a dream, not one of my own, though I have had my share of ancestral dreams, and I will return to that, but a dream that a patient brought to me early in my career, a woman in her mid-30s who came to me complaining of a persistent inability to feel joy. She described herself as someone who had no reason to be unhappy. Comfortable circumstances, a husband she respected, children she loved, and yet nothing, a gray veil between herself and her life. She had tried, she told me, to be grateful. She had tried, she told me, to be happy, and this trying, this effortful, exhausting, dutiful, trying to feel what she thought she should feel was itself one of the symptoms, though she did not know it yet. She brought me this dream. She was in a room she did not recognize, at a desk, and before her was an open drawer filled with letters. The letters were addressed to people she did not know, in handwriting that was not hers. And yet she felt with a peculiar certainty that dreams carry that she was responsible for answering them. She sat at the desk and began to write, and as she wrote, she realized she did not know what to say, because these were not her correspondences, these were not her relationships, these were not her griefs or her promises, and yet the obligation was absolute. The drawer was full, the letters were waiting, and she could not leave until they were answered. When she told me this dream, I did not speak immediately. I let it sit between us, because what she had brought me, in the image of that drawer, was the precise image of her condition. She was living a life of correspondence on behalf of the dead, answering obligations she had inherited without examination, fulfilling emotional duties that had been assigned to her before she had a self with which to refuse them. The gray veil was not depression in the ordinary sense, it was the particular exhaustion of a person who has never yet lived as themselves. This is what I mean by the unfinished ledger. And here is what I want you to understand, because this is where it becomes both more disturbing and, paradoxically, more useful. The entries in that ledger do not wait passively. They are not inert. The unfinished business of the psyche is active. It seeks completion, and it will use whatever instrument is available, including you. The participation mystique that I spoke of earlier is the mechanism when the boundary between self and other, between self and ancestor, has not been sufficiently established. The psychic contents of the other can move freely into the self, not through any supernatural channel, but through the simplest and most ordinary of human processes: imitation, identification, the absorption of emotional patterns in early childhood, the unconscious transmission of affect through tone and gesture, and the particular quality of a parent's silence on certain subjects. You learned very early what was permitted in your family and what was not. You learned what emotions were allowed expression and which ones had to go underground. And the ones that went underground in the generation before you did not simply disappear. They went into the shared unconscious of the family, that living archive of everything that was too dangerous or too painful to be acknowledged. And they waited there for someone with sufficient sensitivity, sufficient porousness, to carry them forward. That person, in many cases, was you. I have called this, in one formulation, the burden of the gifted child. Though gifted is perhaps not the right word, or not the only one. Sensitive, permeable. The child who noticed things, the child who felt the atmosphere before anyone spoke, the child who adjusted themselves to the emotional weather of the adults around them with such unconscious precision that the adults came to depend upon it, came to need, perhaps, that one child to carry what they themselves could not process. And this child, and I want to be direct with you here, this child grows into an adult who has a very specific and very invisible problem. They do not know where they end and where the other begins. They do not know when they feel something, whether that feeling is theirs or whether it is an old transmission from further back in the line. This is the first movement of what I want to examine. We are not yet at the question of what to do. That is not, in any case, my primary interest, nor should it be yours at this stage. What I want first is clarity, the clarity that comes from seeing a thing as it is, without explanation, without consolation, without the rush toward solution that is itself often a defense against the full weight of understanding. You carry more than your own life. That is not a poetic statement. It is a clinical observation. The threads run back. The ledger is real. The coat you are wearing, and I will return to this image, is not yours. It was put on you. It was put on you with love, perhaps, or with the best of intentions, or simply because no one else was willing to wear it. And you were there, and you were young, and you were open, and you have been wearing it ever since. And it has, in certain fundamental ways, shaped how you move through the world, what you allow yourself to want, what you believe you deserve, what you feel you owe, and what you have never, in all your years, dared to put down. We will examine the coat, we will examine the ledger, we will follow the thread, but first we must sit with the full weight of what has already been done. Let me be more specific about the mechanism, because vagueness here would be a disservice. When I say that the unfinished business of ancestors moves through you, I am describing something that is, at its core, a phenomenon of identification. Identification is not a passive thing, it is an active psychological process by which the contents of another's psyche, their fears, their grief, their unexpressed rage, their uncompleted mourning become lodged within you as if they were your own. The process is so early, so deep, and so complete that by the time you are old enough to examine yourself, you find these contents already installed, already operating, already running the deeper programs of your life. I observed this in my clinical work again and again, and I wrote of it in my studies of the archetypes, not always directly, because the academic voice is sometimes insufficient for what I needed to say, but the observation is there, embedded in case after case. A woman who could not marry, not because she did not desire companionship, but because her mother's marriage had been a site of such sustained, silent suffering that to marry was, in her unconscious, to accept the same fate. The mother had never spoken of this suffering. The mother had, in fact, presented her marriage as satisfactory, perhaps even as a model, but the body knew, the nervous system knew, the psyche of the daughter had registered with perfect fidelity. Every tension at the dinner table, every particular quality of the silence that followed her father's voice, every way her mother's face changed infinitesimally, but unmistakably when he entered a room, and this knowledge, this deep somatic knowledge, had settled into the daughter as a conviction, wordless and irrefutable, that marriage meant a certain death of the self. She came to me not knowing any of this. She came to me knowing only that she could not seem to choose a partner, that relationships reached a certain point and she withdrew, that there was something in her, she could not name it, that would not permit her to go further. This is what I mean when I say the inherited coat. You put it on before you knew it was a coat. You believed, for many years, that it was your skin. Now, the moral shadow path, which is what I wish to follow with you today, because there is a particular darkness inside this inherited weight, that I have found to be the most difficult for people to acknowledge. It is not the grief. People can, with sufficient courage, eventually approach the grief. It is not even the fear, though fear too is formidable. The element that is most defended against, most systematically avoided, most thoroughly buried in the ancestral layer is anger. I have seen this in family after family. Across cultures and generations, there is anger that was not permitted. Anger at real injustice, at being dispossessed, at being silenced, at being forced into conditions not chosen, at being required to sacrifice the self for the family, for the country, for survival, real anger with real causes that could not be expressed because expression was too dangerous, too costly, or simply not possible within the emotional vocabulary of the time. And this anger, because it was real, because it had genuine force, did not dissolve. It went underground. It became part of the family's unconscious inheritance, and it arrived in you perhaps as depression, which is anger that has been turned inward and deprived of its object, perhaps as a diffuse, low-level resentment that you feel without knowing toward whom it is directed, perhaps as an inexplicable guilt, because the anger is there, but its target has been obscured. And guilt is what anger becomes when it is not allowed to know itself. In my work on the shadow, and I regard the shadow as one of the most important of the psychological concepts I developed, I observed that the contents of the shadow are not simply personal. There is a personal shadow. Yes, everything the individual has rejected or repressed in themselves. But there is also what I came to think of as the ancestral shadow, the collective deposit of everything the family, the culture, the lineage could not acknowledge about itself. And this ancestral shadow is particularly potent because it has been reinforced across generations. Each generation that refused to see it added to its density. Each generation that chose silence over reckoning deposited another layer. By the time it reaches you, it has the mass of decades, sometimes centuries, and it carries with it not just the content of the original wound, but the energy of all the times that wound was encountered and refused. You feel this as something old, something too large to be simply yours. And you are right, it is too large to be simply yours. But it is expressing itself through you, and until you understand its shape, its origin, and its demands, it will continue to run the deeper programs of your life. Let me tell you about the inherited coat more precisely, because it is the symbol I wish to carry through this examination. The coat was made for someone else. It was made, perhaps, by necessity in circumstances of genuine danger, or loss, or exposure to conditions that required a certain kind of armoring. The person who first wore it needed it. For them, it was not a coat in the comfortable sense, it was protection, and it served its purpose. But then the danger passed, or the person died, or the circumstances changed, and the coat remained. And because the family did not examine it, because families rarely examine what they inherit, particularly from those who suffered, because to examine the coat is to acknowledge the suffering. And to acknowledge the suffering is to feel the grief that the original wearer could not permit themselves. The coat was folded and put away, and then, without ceremony, without explanation, it was given to the next in line. You put it on, you were small, The coat was too large, but you put it on because it was given to you with such naturalness, such total absence of question, that to refuse it would have felt like a refusal of something essential. Perhaps you put it on because your parents wore their versions of it, and you wanted to be like them. Perhaps you put it on because the alternative, the cold exposure of not wearing it, seemed worse. Perhaps you put it on because no one told you there was an alternative. And here is the thing about the inherited coat: it was made for another body, another set of conditions, another set of dangers. The armor that protected your grandmother in her particular circumstances may be the very thing that prevents you from being touched. The caution that kept your grandfather alive in conditions of genuine threat may be the thing that stops you from taking the risks that your own life genuinely requires of you. The silence that was, for someone in your lineage, a strategy for survival in conditions where speech was dangerous, that silence, worn now in conditions of relative safety, becomes a prison, becomes isolation, becomes the inability to be known. The coat is not wrong. I want to be careful here. The coat was not made by malicious people. It was made by people who were doing what they could with what they had, under conditions that were often genuinely terrible. I do not wish to be sentimental about this, but I do not wish to be unjust either. The inheritance you carry was not given to you out of cruelty. It was given to you out of the only love those people knew how to offer, which was often the love of passing on what they believed had kept them alive. But you are not in their conditions, and the coat which served them may be quietly suffocating you. In my observation of patients who came from lineages of significant suffering, and this includes many of the families I worked with in Zurich, families that had been through the disruptions of the early 20th century, its wars and its displacements and its particular horrors, I noticed that the children and grandchildren often carried a very specific kind of psychological burden that I can only describe as a preemptive grief. A grief for disasters that had not yet occurred, an orientation toward the future that was fundamentally defensive, that assumed danger, assumed loss, assumed the worst, not out of pessimism exactly, but out of a deep somatic memory of what had happened before. They were living in their nervous systems as if the catastrophe was still ongoing or were about to begin again. They were wearing the coat not because it was cold, but because somewhere in the deep grammar of their bodies it was understood that the cold could return at any moment. I once wrote, in essence, that the unconscious is not merely the repository of forgotten personal experience, it is the living record of everything the human animal has survived. And in the ancestral layer, what has been survived is carried forward, not as abstract knowledge, but as a body orientation, a default posture toward the world: fight, flay, contract, go silent, defer, perform, appease. These are not character flaws. They are survival strategies. They were once exactly what was needed. The question I bring to you now, and it is the question that individuation demands, is needed by whom? And needed, when I want to be precise about individuation, because it is often misunderstood, particularly in its popular versions, as a kind of self-liberation, a throwing off of all that constrains the individual in favor of some pure, authentic self, This is not what I mean. The self that emerges through individuation is not constructed by subtraction, by simply removing the inherited layers until some pristine original is revealed. There is no such pristine original. You are formed by your formation. The threads that run through you to your ancestors are real threads. You cannot simply cut them, but you can come to know them, and knowing them is itself transformative. Not because knowledge is a kind of magic, but because the unconscious, and this is one of the most fundamental observations I have made in a lifetime of analytical work, the unconscious loses its compulsive power over behavior in direct proportion to how clearly it is seen. What is seen can be chosen or refused. What remains unseen runs you. The difference between wearing the inherited coat consciously and wearing it unconsciously is the difference between a choice and a compulsion. When you know the coat is a coat, when you can feel its weight on your shoulders and recognize that weight as something external to your essential self, something given rather than grown, you are, for the first time, in a position to decide whether to keep it on. You may choose to keep it. Some of what we inherit, when examined, proves to be genuinely valuable, hard-won wisdom, necessary caution, a deep capacity for endurance that was forged in fire and is not to be discarded lightly. But the choice is now yours, and that is an entirely different order of existence from the one you were in before. This is where the moral shadow enters, and I use the word moral deliberately because this is not merely a psychological event, it carries a genuine ethical weight. When you begin to see the inherited coat clearly, when you begin to separate what was given from what is yours, you will inevitably encounter something that most people find deeply uncomfortable: the anger that was folded into the coat when it was made, the anger of the original wearer, unprocessed, still live, and alongside it, and this is the particular cruelty of this phase, your own anger, your anger at having worn something that was not yours for so long, your anger at the years spent in that coat, moving awkwardly, unable to feel the world directly against your skin, unable to know what was genuinely cold and what was merely the coat's memory of cold. This anger is legitimate. I want to say that clearly, because I have found that people who carry a great deal of ancestral weight are often the people least able to permit themselves anger. They have learned, were taught, directly or indirectly, that their anger is dangerous, that it threatens the fragile equilibrium of the family system, that it is selfish or ungrateful or incompatible with love. And so the anger too was folded in, went underground, joined the ledger. But anger, in its healthy form, is not a problem to be managed. It is information. It is the psyche's signal that a boundary has been crossed, not a petty boundary, not a preference, but a genuine boundary of the self. And the anger that arises when you begin to see the inherited coat clearly is telling you something important, that there is a self here, that there are edges to this self, that this self was present even when it was obscured by all that was placed upon it. The anger is paradoxically one of the first signs of genuine individuation, because individuation requires a self, and anger is one of the ways the self announces its existence. We are then at the boundary between what was given and what is genuinely yours, and we must stand here for a while in some discomfort before we move further, I will not rush this. I said we must stand at this boundary. I meant it in the precise sense. The threshold between the inherited life and the examined one is not a place you cross once and leave behind. It is a place you return to, again and again, as more layers are uncovered, as the ledger turns its pages and reveals what was written in earlier hands. Each time you return, the coat is a little more visible, a little more separate from the skin, and each return requires something from you, not heroism, not drama, but a particular quality of sustained attention that most people find very difficult because it demands stillness in the presence of discomfort without the relief of action. I want to describe for you what happens to the psyche at this threshold, because I have observed it closely, and I think the description is useful not as a map to follow, but as a recognition of territory you are likely already in. When a person begins, genuinely begins, not intellectually toying with the idea, but actually beginning the work of separating the inherited from the lived, the first experience is not relief. I want to be very clear about this, because the popular literature on these matters creates a dangerous expectation of catharsis, of breakthrough, of the moment when things become lighter. What actually occurs first, in my experience, both as an analyst and as a man who has done this work in himself, is a deepening of something that feels very much like grief, and simultaneously a strange groundlessness. The coat, you see, however ill-fitting, however heavy, however much it has shaped you towards someone else's life, the coat was also familiar. It was the weight you knew. It organized your days. It told you what was expected of you, what to fear, what to protect. And when you begin to lift it, when you begin tentatively, experimentally, to hold it at arm's length and look at it, you discover that a part of you does not want to put it down, not because it is pleasant to wear, but because the alternative, the self without the coat, is unknown, and the unknown, for a psyche that has been organized around an inherited structure for decades, feels dangerously empty. This is not weakness. It is the precise psychological consequence of having inhabited an identity that was not, at its root, your own. When the borrowed structure begins to loosen, there is, before the genuine self can consolidate, a period of, I will use the word carefully, dissolution. A period in which what you thought you were becomes questionable without any clear replacement. And this dissolution can feel, particularly to those who have relied most heavily on the inherited structure, like annihilation, like a kind of death. It is a kind of death, the death of the persona. In my terminology, the death of the organized self-presentation that was constructed largely from inherited materials, and death, even of what we no longer need, is loss. It has the texture of grief, and it must be grieved. I saw this in many patients, and I want to describe a particular case, not to illustrate a principle, as if the person were merely an example, but because the specificity of the experience is important and generalities obscure it. A man came to me in his late 40s, a man of considerable professional success, who told me, after some weeks of preliminary conversation, that he had never in his life made a single decision that felt genuinely his. He had followed a path, profession, marriage, location, manner of life, that had been laid out for him so early, and so persuasively, and by people he loved and did not wish to disappoint, that the question of what he himself wanted had never quite emerged, or had emerged and been immediately submerged by the stronger current of what was expected. He was not unhappy. Precisely, he was, and this is the word he used, and I have never forgotten it, hollow, as if the life were going on correctly but there was no one quite present inside it. A hollow life, being lived with competence and even apparent satisfaction, but with a fundamental absence at its center. When I listened to the material he brought, I began to hear the familiar notes of the ancestral layer. His father had been a man of frustrated ambition, genuinely gifted, I gathered, in ways that circumstance had not permitted him to develop. The son had been offered, from earliest childhood, the life his father could not have, not as an explicit command, but as an atmosphere, a pervasive and loving pressure, the kind of pressure that is indistinguishable from care. And the son, who loved his father and who registered the father's longing, with the acute sensitivity of a child who has learned to manage the emotional weather of his parents. The son had put on the coat, he had made himself into the fulfillment of his father's unlived life. He had done this successfully, he had achieved what was hoped for him, and he was hollow. This is what I mean by living the ancestral life. Not a failure, not a catastrophe by any external measure, a hollow success, a life completed on behalf of someone else. The thread, and here is where the symbol I have been carrying becomes most precise. The thread connects this man to his father's longing, to the specific form that longing took in the family's unconscious mythology, and the thread is not cut by the simple act of noticing it. Noticing it is only the beginning. What is required is a slow, difficult, and often painful process of disentanglement, of learning, decision by decision, which of your desires are genuinely yours and which are transmissions, which of your fears are rooted in your actual experience and which are the somatic memories of dangers your ancestors faced, which of your values you have examined and chosen and which was simply in the coat when you put it on. I want to say something here about the children of people who suffered greatly, because I think this particular inheritance is the most misunderstood. The children and the grandchildren of people who experienced significant trauma, displacement, persecution, or loss carry a very specific form of the ancestral weight. They carry not only the unfinished grief of the original suffering, but also something that I can only describe as a prohibition on their own flourishing. This prohibition is rarely explicit. It operates at a level beneath language, beneath conscious intention, but its effects are unmistakable. A person who grew up in the shadow of a parent's great suffering, whether that suffering was spoken of or more commonly, carefully not spoken of, absorbs through the participation mystique I described earlier, a fundamental message that can be rendered something like this: your life, in its fullness and pleasure and possibility, is somehow an insult to what I endured. Your joy, unearned, undeserved by suffering, is a kind of betrayal. The parent does not say this. The parent, in many cases, sincerely wants the opposite. They want their child to be free, to have the life they could not have, to inherit ease rather than suffering. And yet, and this is the paradox that breaks my heart somewhat, To use an uncharacteristic phrase, what is transmitted is not the wish but the wound. Because the wound is alive in the body, the wish is in the mind. And the body speaks more loudly in the language the child listens to most carefully. And so the child grows up with a subterranean guilt about their own happiness, a conviction, never examined because never articulated, that to be fully alive is to abandon the parent's suffering, to move so far into one's own life that the suffering is left behind. And with it, somehow, the parent, and this the child cannot do, not because of weakness, but because of love, because the participation mystique is not only a psychological mechanism, it is also a form of loyalty, a way of remaining connected to those who gave you life, even when what you are remaining connected to is their pain. I have seen this manifest in 100 forms. The child who cannot earn more than the suffering parent, the child who remains close to failure, who circles it, approaches it, retreats from it because success feels like desertion, the child who chooses partners who need to be saved, because saving is the emotional grammar of the family, the mode of love that was modeled and absorbed, the child who cannot rest, cannot permit themselves ease, because ease was not available to the parent, and to enjoy what the parent could not enjoy is, in the logic of the inherited world, a kind of abandonment. This is the unfinished ledger again. The entries were made in the parent's life, entries of loss, of injustice, of deprivation, and the child has taken on the task of keeping the books, not closing them, keeping them, maintaining the weight of the account, ensuring that the suffering is remembered, honored, not betrayed by an excessive living of one's own life. I do not say this to accuse the child, I say it to name the mechanism, because the mechanism, once named, can be examined, and what can be examined can, with sufficient courage and sufficient time, be changed. The second dream I want to offer you again, drawn from clinical material, came from a patient who had spent 30 years in a helping profession, not out of genuine vocation. She eventually came to understand, but out of the family's unspoken requirement that the self be placed consistently in service to others. She had entered the profession with genuine feeling. She had believed at 22 that this was her calling, but she had not examined whether the calling was hers or whether it was the family's projection of what a good life should look like. A life that earns its keep through perpetual usefulness. She brought me this dream. She was walking in shoes that were too large. She was walking in them for what felt like years. She knew, in the dream, that this walking had been going on for years, and she had grown so accustomed to the ill fit that she had developed a particular gait, a compensation, a way of walking that kept the shoes on but was not her natural stride. And then, in the dream, she sat down and she looked at the shoes and she saw that they were not hers. They were, she felt with the dream's certainty, her mother's shoes, or perhaps her grandmother's. The size seemed to shift, and she sat there, looking at them, and did not yet take them off. The dream ended there, with her looking. I found this dream extraordinarily precise. The shoes too large, worn for years. shaping the gait, the compensation, the specific, adapted walk that looked from outside like her natural way of moving, but was, in fact, a constant management of an ill fit, and the sitting down and looking, which is already something, already a movement toward consciousness, toward the possibility of choice, but not yet the removal, not yet. This is where most people are. In my experience, they have sat down, they are looking at the shoes, they have not yet taken them off, and this, the sitting and looking, requires more courage than it appears to. Because to look clearly is to begin to know the extent of what will be required. And the extent is considerable. I want to say something about time here before we continue, because individuation is not an event. It is not a realization, however dramatic, that permanently reorganizes the psyche. It is a process, and it is a long one, and it moves at the speed of genuine change, which is much slower than insight. You may have insights, sudden, lucid, precisely calibrated recognitions of exactly what you have been carrying and why, and then wake up the next morning and find yourself in the coat again, finding yourself walking in the shoes too large, finding yourself answering the letters in the drawer that are not addressed to you. This is not failure. This is the nature of deep psychological work. The unconscious does not yield its contents permanently on the first asking, it yields them gradually, and only as the conscious self becomes strong enough and roomy enough to hold them. The strength required is not willpower. This I must emphasize, because the Western temperament, particularly the American temperament, and I have observed it closely, has a tendency to translate every psychological challenge into a problem of willpower. If I want it enough, if I try hard enough, if I discipline myself sufficiently, but the work I am describing is not the work of effort, it is the work of attention, of sustained, non-defensive, non-consoling attention to what is actually present in your psyche. This attention is, perhaps, the rarest thing we have been circling, and now I will come to the center. The question that the inherited weight eventually forces you to ask forces, not invites, because the psyche is not polite in this regard, is the question of which life you are living, not whether your life is good or bad by external measures, not whether you have been successful or loved or useful, but whether the life is yours, whether the one living it is, in any genuine sense, you. This question cannot be answered quickly. It requires the accumulation of all the observations we have been making, the ancestral layer, the participation mystique, the unfinished ledger, the coat, the shoes too large. It requires that you have sat, at least once, with the full weight of what you carry, without deflection, without the rush towards solution, without the comfort of believing that understanding is the same as transformation. It requires something that I have found most people will do almost anything to avoid. It requires that you remain for a sustained period in not knowing. Not knowing is not ignorance. It is the condition that precedes genuine knowledge. When you strip away the inherited certainties, the certainty about who you are, about what you owe, about what constitutes a good life, about what you are permitted to want, you enter a period that can only be described as psychic darkness. not the dramatic darkness of crisis, but something quieter and in some ways more difficult, the darkness of genuine uncertainty about the shape of your own self. Now that the borrowed shape has been questioned, I have called this the night sea journey, the descent into the unconscious that precedes, always, genuine renewal. And I want to be honest with you about what this descent contains, because the popular renderings of it tend to romanticize what is, in fact, a very difficult piece of work. The descent contains anger, real anger, often at people you love. This is what makes it so difficult. The anger at parents who gave you the coat, who gave it to you with love, who wore their own versions of it and knew no other way of passing on what they valued. This anger is legitimate, and it is painful, and it is absolutely necessary, and it will feel, when it arrives, like a betrayal of love. It is not, it is the psyche insisting on its own existence, but it will feel like betrayal, and you must be prepared for this feeling. The descent contains grief, the grief for the years in the coat, the grief for the choices not made because the coat made them impossible, the grief for the self that was present all along. Underneath the inherited weight, waiting with a patience that is itself almost unbearable to contemplate when you finally turn to face it, waiting to be inhabited. And the descent contains, underneath the anger and the grief, something that most people do not expect: a quiet, a groundedness, a sense of encountering something that has been present the entire time. Beneath the layers, beneath the borrowed life, beneath the performance of the persona, something that is simply, stubbornly, specifically you, not a grandiose self, not a liberated hero, something smaller and more precise than that, the actual shape of your desires, your values, your genuine limits and genuine capacities. Stripped of the overlay of what was given, this is what Jung called the self with a capital S, to distinguish it from the ego, the small organizing self of daily life. And I want to be clear that the encounter with the self is not triumphant. It is, in my experience, both more modest and more strange than triumph. It is the encounter with something that you recognize as having always been present, as having quietly persisted through all the years of borrowed living, as being neither the coat nor the body within the coat, but something even more fundamental, the awareness that was there before the coat was put on. I spoke earlier of the moral shadow. I want to return to it now, because this is where the integration must occur. An integration of the shadow is not comfortable work. The anger I described, the anger that rises when you begin to see clearly, carries within it, if you can hold it long enough without acting it out and without swallowing it back down, a tremendous amount of information about your actual values, as opposed to the inherited ones, information about what you genuinely cannot accept, as opposed to what you have been performing acceptance of for decades, information about the texture of your genuine self, its particular grain, its specific resistances, its authentic preferences. The shadow that is integrated does not disappear. I must be precise about this, because integration is another of those concepts that popular psychology has distorted. Integration does not mean the darkness becomes light. It does not mean the anger becomes peace. It means the anger becomes available. It means the energy that was locked in the denied content, locked in the ancestral inheritance, locked in the coat, locked in the shoes too large, becomes accessible to the whole person, becomes available for the genuine work of living one's own life. The boundary that emerges from integrated shadow is not a wall. It is not the boundary of a defended, frightened person. It is something more precise and, I think, more interesting than that. It is the boundary of genuine knowledge of the self, knowledge of what this particular life can sustain and what it cannot, what this particular person genuinely values and what they have been pretending to value, what is a real limit and what was merely the limit of the coat. And here is what I observe in people who have done this work seriously, who have sat with the full weight of the inherited life and not fled from it, their boundaries. When they emerge, have a very different quality from the boundaries of those who have not. They are not apologetic, they are not explained, they are not accompanied by the elaborate justifications that are always the sign of a person who does not quite believe in their own right to the boundary. They are simply the natural edges of a self that knows its own shape. The thread, the symbol I have been carrying does not get cut in this process. I want to be clear about this, because a certain reading of individuation suggests a kind of heroic severance, a rupture from the ancestral chain. This is not accurate to what I observed, and it is not accurate to what I lived. The thread remains, the connection to the ancestors remains. You are still in the lineage. You still carry traces of what they carried. You are still, in certain ways, the ongoing expression of a psychic inheritance that extends backward further than you can trace. But your relationship to the thread changes. Instead of being pulled by it, you hold it. Instead of being the instrument through which the ancestral compulsion completes itself, you become the one who can choose consciously, with full awareness of what you are doing and why, which elements of the inheritance to carry forward and which to lay down. You become, in the precise sense, the one in your lineage who saw it clearly, and seeing it clearly is itself a kind of gift to those who come after you, because the ancestral shadow does not only move forward in time, it can also, through the work of one conscious individual, begin to thin, to lose some of its compulsive density. The children of a person who has done this work inherit something different from the children of a person who has not. They do not inherit a cleared slate, but they inherit less of the fog. In my work on the development of personality, I observed that the fully developed person is not the one who has escaped all inheritance, all shadow, all ancestral weight. That person does not exist. The fully developed person is the one who has brought sufficient consciousness to their inheritance that they are no longer simply its vehicle. They have become, instead, its witness, and the witness is not passive. The witness who sees clearly can act, can choose, can, in moments of genuine freedom, and genuine freedom is always momentary, always partial, always costly, put down what does not belong and pick up what does. I want to say something about the ledger in this final movement, the unfinished ledger, the entries of loss and injustice and unexpressed grief that were passed to you. You cannot complete those entries on behalf of those who made them. This is important. A great deal of psychological suffering comes from the unconscious attempt to complete what others left unfinished to complete. Finally, the mourning that was not permitted, to right the injustice that was not redressed, to speak the anger that was swallowed, You feel the unfinished weight in yourself, and your instinct is to finish it, to resolve it, to close the account. But the account cannot be closed by proxy. The original mourner must mourn. The original anger must find its original object. And since both are now in the past, since the person who needed to grieve is gone, since the injustice is historical, the proxy cannot complete the work. What the proxy can do, what you can do, is recognize that you are holding it, can see the ledger clearly, can make a conscious decision not to add new entries of the same kind, not to pass the same code forward, not to give the shoes too large to the next generation, as if they were simply what everyone wears. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, considerable, to be the generation that sees clearly, that holds the ancestral weight with full awareness and chooses not to be its unwitting carrier, to transform compulsion into conscious carrying and eventually into conscious laying down. This is the work I have given my life to describing, and it is the work, I believe, that you have already begun. I will not tell you it becomes easier. The work of individuation does not become easier. It becomes, in a certain sense, more demanding as it proceeds. Because the deeper you go, the older the material you encounter, and the older the material, the less familiar the ground you will encounter as you continue, contents that feel alien, affects, image, convictions that seem to have no origin in your personal history. These are the deeper layers of the collective unconscious, the truly archaic material that underlies the personal. Do not be frightened by this, but do not approach it casually. The deep unconscious is not a therapeutic resource to be mined for growth. It is a living force, and it demands respect. But you are not alone in this. No individual is ever entirely alone in the work of individuation, because the work of individuation is, paradoxically, the work of discovering how deeply connected you are, not the dissolved, unconscious connection of participation, mystique, but the conscious, examined connection of a person who knows both their separateness and their belonging, who can hold both the thread and the scissors, and who knows, in each moment which is required, you carry more than your own life. This remains true. It will remain true until you die. But what you do with what you carry, whether you carry it blindly, compulsively, without choice, or whether you carry it consciously, with knowledge of its weight and origin and meaning. This is the question that individuation answers, not by removing the weight, by making you equal to it. The coat is still on your shoulders, the ledger is still in your hands, the thread runs back, as it always has, into the lives of those who came before you. None of this has changed. What has changed, what the psychological event I have been tracing has completed, is that you now know you are wearing it. You now know the name of what you carry. That knowing is not comfort. It is not relief. It is the beginning of a life that, for the first time, is fully yours to live or to refuse. The psychological event has completed. You see the coat. You are still wearing it. What you do next is no longer inheritance. It is choice.